So we are live. You're listening to Misery Tourism's MiseryTourism.com's Misery Movies podcast, which is basically a film discussion and review podcast about movies about human suffering. That's about as concise as I can make it. Um, each week or each episode, the idea that we release these on a weekly basis is frankly absurd. Um, but each episode we discuss a different film that's picked by a different member of our podcast crew. And basically, the first half of the podcast is a spoiler free overview of the film. We talk about it in general terms. We talk about the themes, the ideas of the film, maybe a little bit about the cinematography or the script to some degree, the characters, the performances, whatever. But we steer clear of anything that will spoil the film for you. At the end of the first half, we each of us reviews the film very briefly, and then after that, we launch into the second half of the podcast, which will contain spoilers. And that segment will go deeper into maybe the ending of the film, also specific scenes that we liked or didn't like. Um, and yeah, that's pretty much it. So I am joined by, first of all, I'm Will, and I'm joined by a few of our regular Misery Tourism contributors here, AJ,
Yo.
Brandon,
Hello, hello.
and Rudy.
Taste the wind.
So we are in the midst of, we're in the fourth and final episode, probably final episode, considering Halloween is right around the corner, of a Halloween movie marathon series of podcasts. And in these podcasts, we've been looking at, you know, I don't know, spooky films, films that are at least vaguely supernatural or vaguely Halloweeny in some way or another. Maybe horror films, maybe not necessarily horror films. So the last movie that we're doing in that series is one I selected, and that's the um, Japanese ghost story film Kwaidan. So I don't know. We should probably launch into a discussion of the film here, but before we do that, I suppose it's my job, since it's my movie, to provide a synopsis of the film. One thing that's worth mentioning right off the bat is that this is an anthology film. It's actually a series of 4 individual segments or vignettes about, and each of those segments is based on a different Japanese ghost story. Most of them are based on actually a folklore collection called Kwaidan, which is where the director drew most of his material from. And each of them presents a sort of different twist on, I don't know, Japanese folk mythology about ghosts and spirits and other supernatural things. I don't want to get too much into the content of any of the individual stories before we get to our spoiler section, although we might touch on them lightly here shortly. I don't know, guys. Is there something you wanted to talk about with regarding this film? Anyone want to get us started here? No? Hearing a lot of
Yeah, not really a whole lot to say on this one for once. Not often that you have a movie where there's nothing really bad you can say, but I also can't really think of anything great to say either.
Huh. So this movie didn't have much of an impact on you at all.
Not really. No, I think it was kind of a Japanese version of Grimm's fairy tales.
I suppose you could say that. Um, let me start by asking you guys this. So far, the first 3 movies we've done in this sort of Halloween movie marathon series um, have not been scary films. The first one was What We Do in the Shadows, which was a comedy. And it was a vampire comedy. It was a horror comedy, maybe, but it was really not intended to be scary. The second one was Zombievers, which was I don't know. I don't even know if it was intended to be scary, but it was mostly just really incredibly obnoxious and a huge waste of time. Thanks again, Sarah. The third one, which
Yeah,
was
yeah, yeah. Thanks again for that.
the third one, which was Brandon's choice, was 13 Demons, which was I suppose, a horror film about about a possessed board game or a board game that causes the players to I don't know, lose their shit and think they're paladins who are fighting demons or something. And anyway, I didn't. Did anyone find that movie scary at all? Frightening?
Nope.
No, no.
No, I didn't.
I did not.
No. So let me ask you this: this is our last chance to pick a scary movie, then to actually do a scary movie for Halloween. So did anyone here find this movie scary at all?
I did vaguely. It wasn't.
Without getting into spoilers.
It wasn't very. It didn't scare me, but like it was definitely more scary than a lot of movies that I've seen. If that makes sense.
Does. B-Boy, you've seen a lot of horror movies. First of all, have you ever seen a horror movie that scared you? And second of all, did this horror movie scare you?
Have I ever seen a horror movie that scared me? That's a good question. Um, I remember a scene from a horror movie that scared me as a child, where someone's heart was ripped out through their chest by I don't know, a demon possessed woman. That one scene scared me. The rest of it, nothing. Dan, for me, honestly, felt like I was watching a series of bedtime stories.
So not scary then.
Not in the least. It was.
Not in the
This
least.
was
Okay.
probably the most relaxing ghost movie I've ever seen.
Huh, that's interesting. Rudy.
Uh, Not really. No, I didn't really find it scary. Um, wow. I mean, I guess this is the kind of movie that I probably would have found scary as a kid, I guess,
Really?
but not really now. I honestly, I don't even know about that because I've never really been scared by any movies really, so not one to scare from movies, so
Hmm.
especially
See,
not horror movies.
I have not. I can't really think of any movies that have scared me as an adult. I mean, I can think of. I'm sure that pretty much everything scared me when I was a kid. I mean, I was a pretty huge pussy. I mean, I still am, but I'm just scared of human interaction and having to go outside of my apartment. But there's not much fictional that scares me anymore. But I will say, I watched this movie for the first time a year ago, and it fucked me up. Like I did not. I had trouble going to sleep the night the night that I watched it, and it stuck with me in a way that I don't think any other horror movie have. I mean, there have been horror movies that I've watched that have gotten me with a jump scare or something, but after that, I've mostly just been angry at the movie. Like, oh, it like it like. Ugh, and then you're like, oh, and it's like that was cheap. I feel like I feel like I was assaulted a little bit. I don't feel like that was earned. And this is the first movie I think I've watched that has gotten, as an adult anyway, that has gotten under my skin in a really profound way and spooked me in a way that I thought was earned, which is why I picked it for the podcast. Um,
Will's a pussy.
all right, yeah, I mean I am, but
What? Stop scare shaming.
I don't really want to talk about exactly what scared me in this movie. I will say that it was two of the four vignettes scared me, and the other two didn't. But or it didn't really scare me that much. But I think what it is about this movie as a horror film that I think makes it work as a horror film is that, as I said, I think that to the degree that it scares you or doesn't scare you, or to the degree that it affects you emotionally in any way, I think it earns that. This movie doesn't use any of the cheap tactics that horror movies use. Well, with one possible small exception, which we can talk about later, but there are no jump scares in this. In fact, the movie is very consciously, I think, constructed in a way to diffuse the possibility of there being any true jump scares. Maybe we can talk about that
Mhm.
later. Um, there are there are no there's no gore in this movie. There are no characters making absurd, stupid decisions that get them killed. There's no irrational behavior that leads to cheap, unearned scares. There's no contrived plotting that that most horror movies have. That sort of intense amount of work the movie will put into to manufacture a scary moment. Instead, this movie's actually almost kind of meditative in that it very much eases you into a sense of unease, if that makes any sense. It slowly works away at you in a very methodical way. It slowly whittles you down. Uh, and if you give it your full attention, I feel like anyway, it works its way under your skin. But I know you guys may disagree with me about that since you weren't particularly scared by it. But what did you think?
I think meditative is definitely a good word for it. Um, there was definitely a sense of ease to the way that the stories played out, and that's not just a knock at the fact that this movie is just over 3 hours long and tells four separate stories. Um, but yeah, there's definitely a sense of ease to it where they take their time and they build things up slowly. There's definitely that sense of an actual logical build-up that you don't really get in a lot of the American horror movies. That I think that they actually did really well with this. That aspect, but I think that in a lot of ways they kind of milked certain things too long. Um, it just kind of left me wanting in some ways.
So that's interesting that you're talking about the pacing of the film then. Really, you think that these segments may have been a little bit too slow, a little bit too
Yeah,
does
yeah. Personally, I think that it would have been better if there would have been less of the repetitive nature in some of the scenes.
yeah. Anyone else want to get in on the pacing of the film?
I would. And
Okay.
I can't help myself but make a jab at B-Boy for getting on Kwaidan for the repetitive nature when he chose 13 demons. They were
Boy,
literally doing the same thing for 6 minutes straight. Anyway,
AJ, you're out for
Yeah.
blood
That's
tonight.
Yeah.
a fair shot, AJ. That's a fair shot.
I would say that there was one of the 4 stories that I felt the pacing lagged a little bit, but I'm not actually sure if that was just because I was getting tired at that point. Because I could I feel like every repetitive moment in even that story was there for a purpose and it served the story well. But like I could feel myself kind of wishing it would hurry up a little bit.
Hmm.
um I would like to say about the scariness of the film is that I didn't feel like it was scary basically at all, but it was very interesting. It did stick with you a little bit, um, but in like not in a particularly potent way for me.
Hmm. That's interesting. But Rudy, what about how did you feel about the pacing of the film?
I think the pacing was pretty good because I normally cannot sit through movies, and this was actually an exception as far as like I guess probably the fact that they were all short vignettes probably helped a little bit. But I feel like the build up to the scare or whatever, if you want to call it that, was
Right.
pretty much just right. Like,
Yeah, I agree with you. That's the way I feel. Is actually I think the pacing in these films are basically perfect. I don't think there was actually anything I wouldn't use the word repetitive anyway. I could see why you would say that some of the segments were slow, that they were methodical, that they really took their time in moving towards uh, the end result. An end result that in these movies, by the way, often feels inevitable, which is something that I actually liked about the film. Is that there aren't many twists, at least in the way you think of a twist in a horror film. The
That's
movies
true.
end at a very natural conclusion, or the segments end up at a very natural conclusion, and one that you probably in most cases saw coming. Although there's a couple of them where there's a real subversion there, um, in the way that it ultimately resolves. But what was I saying? But I feel like um, that is actually in the film's service. Like that's a feature, not a bug of the film. Because the fact that you know where it's going allows you to focus on everything else that's happening. The movie spends a lot of time on its characters and also building atmosphere, right? And I think that because the film is
Mhm.
somewhat slow in its pacing, that there's just more time for that, if it makes any sense. And I think that there's actually nothing repetitive, though, in that, even though I'm being repetitive right now, there's nothing repetitive because I think that every scene in this film, if you went back and watched the film again, you would potentially find that, first of all, every scene lasts exactly as long as it needs to. Unlike 13 Demons, where every scene lasted 3 or 4 minutes longer than it needed to. But no single scene goes on longer than it needs to arrive at its natural endpoint or to do whatever it kind of exists to do. Also, no scene in this film exists just to reiterate something that happened in a previous scene. Actually, each scene is almost um, a natural evolution from the scene before it, if that makes any sense. Like things change incrementally from scene to scene in a way that really draws you towards the ultimate conclusion of each of these stories. I'm sorry, I can hear myself. Let me see. I can also hear like people opening doors and stuff. I don't know if that's related to me being able to hear myself.
Can
Uh,
you hear yourself now?
test, test. No, it must be Rudy's.
Yeah, that's weird.
yeah, I don't know what's going on. Let me try turning my volume down a little bit.
Okay.
All right, try it now.
Test. Yeah, I can still hear myself.
Huh? Really?
Wait, wait. Huh. No, I can't anymore.
You
Whatever.
can't?
I can't
Oh,
now. Yeah.
okay.
Okay. So I do think that the pacing, I can see someone watching this film and saying, "Oh my god, like nothing is happening. I was expecting some fucking ghosts, and where are the ghosts?" Like I could see that, or especially since there's a lot of time spent here on human relationships too, which I think is really thematically important, but often may seem tangential to
Mm.
like the supernatural parts of the film. But I really do think that the pacing, even if it's deliberate, is really effective. And that I think if the movie moved through these stories more quickly, uh, the tension or the kind of escalating sense of dread or the way that it almost like pulls you into like the way it blends like blurs the line between the real and the supernatural or the real and the fantastical. I don't think that would work if the movie was flying from plot point to plot point, I guess.
Yeah, I guess I see what you're saying. And yeah, repetitive may not have been the right word. Yeah, I guess it was more of a certain level of tedium to it.
So do you
But
mean like
that's a personal opinion, I guess.
would you mean that like there's not enough action going on?
Not even necessarily that. Just for me, it just felt like it dragged because of how long some of the setups were. And I'm not saying that the setup wasn't important or that the setup didn't have its payoff, but for me, it felt like there was too much setup when, like you said, the endings to each vignette seemed so natural. And to me, they really were predictable. Like halfway into the story, you already see how it's going to end because these are such, it's based on fairy tales, it's based on folklore, and these stories are so classic and so standard that we're all used to this, to the setup of these stories. So for me, some of the stories that took that longer time to build up and build and build and build, it may have felt repetitive to me because I am so used to the format
Mm.
that it's kind of an automatic thing. Like, all right, I already know exactly where this is going, and yet you keep going and going and going.
Yeah, I can definitely imagine someone saying this film feels tedious or this film feels slow. That wasn't my experience with the film at all, but I could definitely I think it really a lot of it has to do with your expectations of a film, you know? What do you expect from a film? And I think if you're and I think for a lot of people, and I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with this, but I do think for a lot of people like plot advancement, being able to see the plot moving forward and feel like the plot moving forward in a propulsive way is really important. And I think that's actually one of the major dividing lines when it comes to what movies certain people do or do not enjoy. I think you could make a lot of noise about like, oh well, oh well, some people like really like only like contemporary movies with like a lot of explosive special effects or whatever. They really only like Michael Bay films or something. But I don't think that's the case with most people. I think that a lot of those people, if you if they went home and they watched like an old fashioned kind of western, would enjoy that too, but would never be able to
Mm-hmm.
sit through an Ingmar Bergman film. Would never be able to like sit through a Tarkovsky film. And I think that's the distinction, really, more than necessarily some need to have your be dazzled by special effects or whatever. I think for a lot of people, there really needs to be the sense that there's some forward momentum to the plot. And if that's something you need, I can see why this movie would be painful in parts. But I actually, I actually, I'm almost very anti-plot in some ways. Like a lot of times, like if I feel the plot moving forward, I'm like, stop. No, I don't want any more plot. Fuck it. I don't like if I start to feel the plot. Not in every movie. I mean, there are some movies that are really cleverly constructed that are mostly plot, but like Christopher Nolan makes these movies that are like 100% plot mechanics, and most of the time it works really effectively. I mean, Interstellar is probably the only Christopher Nolan film I have not enjoyed.
Ugh.
Yeah, we won't talk about Interstellar. That would be a whole other can of worms.
Yeah, why would you even bring that up?
But and so it's possible to make a really great film that is mostly just a really well tuned like machine, just like like the sort of this a deist like divine watchmaker approach to filmmaking where the director builds this perfect little mechanism and then sets it aside to run on its own. But for the most part, movies that feel too mechanical in that way turn me off, which I think is another thing that I really enjoyed about this movie.
Yeah, I mean, I guess as far as the pacing goes, like the scenes are the shots are held for a really long time in a lot of scenes. Um, a lot of this scenery and stuff is pretty static, like the backgrounds and all that stuff. So it's not really that could contribute to the feeling of, I guess, tedium also.
That's right. There's not a lot of fancy camera work going on here, with a few exceptions. Like there aren't that many like a lot of the shots are held, as you said. They don't cut between what you see in films today, a close up of someone's face while they're talking. Okay, here's another angle on the same thing. Here's an angle, here's a wide one, here's a close up, all within the same scene. He, there are a few really, at least one that I can think of, and probably more than that, effective like pan shots or shots where the camera is moving with the narrative, or moving with the action on the screen, or just moving across, um, moving through a set even. There's one scene like that very early in the film that's really effective. But you're right, Rudy. I think that it's not like that kind of dynamic editing. And I think that actually is to the movie's benefit. You guys can feel free to disagree with me about that. But I think that really, especially considering how effectively some of the sets are constructed, the fact that there are so many shots that are wide and stay wide, I think is really to its benefit, really helps to build atmosphere.
I would agree with that.
I also
Yeah.
agree. I think the camera work is really effective in this movie.
Yeah, for me, honestly, having those wide angle sustained shots, it made me feel a lot like I was actually watching a play and not a movie.
That's
Yeah.
actually, I got the sense a couple different times through the movie that it felt like a play, particularly with like some of the ways that they use the lighting, and I
Yes.
really enjoyed that.
Yeah, I actually remember one specific
Yeah.
point in the third one when I can hear myself again. Maybe Rudy, if you mute your mic when you're not talking, maybe that will. It's worth a try. Okay. Um, Sorry about that. So I can think of at least one. Oh, I can hear myself still with Rudy's mic muted, so it's not Rudy.
Hmm.
Let me see.
Yeah, I don't know.
Test. Let me try now. Oh, I can't hear myself anymore. It was AJ
Yeah,
all along. Oh, and she's gone.
something is weird with Hangouts, I think.
Yeah. wait and see.
Good old technologies.
I'm gonna
Yep.
refill my water while EJ's gone.
Damn.
Oh my gosh! Now there's
Oh,
huge
there's static.
Jeez. Am I staticky?
Yes.
Oh nope, you sound really? I think
No?
you sound. I thought you sound pretty good now.
Test, test, test.
A little staticky.
Yeah, a little staticky.
Hmm. Still staticky?
Talk some more.
I'm testing microphone settings now.
Yeah, still staticky.
Yeah, you're still a little bit on my end.
Jesus. What about now?
You're way worse.
That's worse. Yeah.
Yeah,
And I
much
can hear
worse.
myself again.
Yeah, I can too. Actually, I can hear myself.
What about now?
Talk
Oh,
some
that's
more.
better.
Is it staticky still?
Yes.
Yeah.
God damn it.
Oh, Mr. Bones, you're biting me. Biting. Bitey cat.
Is it still staticky now?
Yes. In fact, it's pretty bad.
I'm not sure what else I can do.
Ooh, now I can hear a phone ringing.
What phone call?
That was me.
AJ,
Why isn't your phone on
ringing?
silent?
I was testing noises. What about now?
Talk some more. You have to say more than just what about now.
Tell me
Saying
more.
stuff. I'm saying things. I'm saying lots of
Oh,
words.
wow, it just got really bad for a
That's
second.
worse.
It was good, and then it got bad in the middle.
Alright, saying more words. Seeing if it works. Does it work?
It's bad.
Still staticky.
Oh, how would I leave? How would I just leave?
I don't know what's wrong. You've never had this problem before on past podcasts.
It's the same settings as I was like 2 seconds ago.
Do you have anything that might be fucking with your sound card or
Not that I'm aware of.
anything weird open? And check your gear and make sure that like everything is set to the headset, nothing set to your speakers.
Steam's not
anything-
open, is it?
Yeah.
Is,
Still.
is it good now or is it bad now?
It's
It sounds better on my end.
Sounds better on my end too.
you need to talk more.
I'm talking more so you can hear if it's good now or bad now.
It's staticky.
God damn it.
The weird thing
I'm not
is
hearing any static.
you're not?
I'm hearing a little bit.
No, I'm not hearing any.
Weird thing is you're much louder than you usually are, so I'm wondering if you have your microphone volume way up. Or if you have the mic really close to your face or something.
What about now?
It sounds the same.
That
Yeah.
sounds about the same to me. I wonder, do they update Google Hangouts like all the time or something? It seems like every
Maybe.
fucking time it's completely different how the sound quality comes
I
out.
bet. I mean, it really does seem weird.
What about now? Can you
Holy
hear?
shit!
Oh, that's a lot of static.
Oh,
Oh, god damn it.
Whatever you just did, do the opposite of that.
The opposite.
Oh shit, is it still terrible?
It's
I
still
can hear it
staticky.
still.
Oh jeez.
Oh, jeez.
I hope literally no one watches the YouTube video.
I can't imagine that anyone does.
I would doubt it.
If they
What
do, I hope
about-
they really only stick around for Rudy's weird dog.
Yeah, the dog. Alright, is it worse or is it better?
It's better.
Yeah, you sound
Okay.
better
Yeah,
to me.
it's
It's
better.
better, perhaps even totally. Talk a little more so that we don't get.
I'm talking a little more and saying a couple more things.
Yeah, you sound much better now.
Oh, cool.
What did you do?
I just fiddled with the microphone settings until I found something new.
Oh, okay.
Fascinating.
Okay. All right. So Rudy, you don't need to mute your mic. It was AJ all. Okay. So picking up where we left off, there was one scene in particular during the third segment or the third story when I had exactly the same thought. I said, "Wow, I really feel like I'm watching a play. I really feel like I'm watching theater." I think it was because of
Yeah.
the construction of that particular set, but I think you're right. And the backdrops, I think, really contribute to that. The fact that
Yeah.
so many
Yeah.
of the, even though they feature like rather organic, natural looking foregrounds, often they're set in uh, somewhat mundane looking locations as far as the foreground is concerned. A lot of them use these hand painted backgrounds or backdrops that give it a really weird sort of ethereal, ephemeral, supernatural, whatever you want to say, this really distinct look. And I think that probably really contributes to the sense that you're watching a play, right? You're watching because it almost looks like the kind of possibly hand painted backdrop that they might use in a play, because obviously you can't just be like, okay guys, we're this one's set in a gazebo, let's all go, this scene set in a gazebo, let's all go outside, or this scene set by a river, let's all go and sit by the river.
Yeah, for me the standout in that category was in the second vignette with that winter sky.
Oh,
Yeah.
That to
God.
me was just absolutely amazing visually.
Yeah.
We should,
No,
It
yeah.
was a very effective thing.
we should definitely talk about the look a bit because this movie is absolutely gorgeous. Like, I would probably say it's the most beautiful movie I've ever seen.
I would agree with you. I was going to say pretty much the same thing. This is the only films there are a few Tarkovsky films, Stalker, Solaris, The Mirror, that might come close to this, but if you're talking about competition for the most beautiful film ever made, the most like purely visually gorgeous film, this is either number one or it's certainly in the top five. It really, I haven't, as I said, aside from a few of Tarkovsky's films, I don't think anything even comes close to this. Certainly not like a lot of contemporary films that are very self-consciously pretty. Wes Anderson,
Mhm.
um, that really seem to pay a lot of attention to manufacturing a very specific kind of visual aesthetic.
Mhm.
A lot of those movies, so in best case scenario, some of those movies do look very good, but they are just not on the level of like sheer visual wonder that's produced by this film. And I'm not sure. Do you guys want to talk about that at all?
I mean, like this it doesn't come close to Wes Anderson films. It really doesn't. Like, this film is really gorgeous. It uses, I don't know, it's very striking the way that it uses color, especially the second and third stories. Those two in particular are there's a lot of contrast, but also it uses this extremely odd sort of uncanny valley type effect where everything looks um, very fake and created and almost like the small little like Christmas town figurines you find in the mall or in a specialty Christmas shop where there's a bunch of small people and trees that's all been handcrafted, but it all looks extremely real at the same time. While I was watching it, I kind of got this odd, like old never-ending story kind of feel to it, but never ending story has like this all the obvious fake creatures and the costumes, and it's all very kitschy and just like really bad. and and Kwaidan is so real in the way that it seems created. It it's really odd, and that combined with the story and how like the supernatural is blended with the real really gives it a kind of interesting blended effect between the look and the plot.
Yeah, I was going to say you almost took the words out of my mouth exactly. I think that this is a movie about, like, I don't want to say liminal spaces, but it's a movie about spaces that exist between the real and the supernatural, right? Which is what folklore is always in some way about, the like intrusion of the supernatural or the otherworldly on the mundane and the real. And a lot of
Mhm.
movies um, will will swing really far in one direction or another. Like they'll either do the like found footage thing where they are trying their damnedest to seem as real as possible, even though it's a horror film, to really make everyone watching it feel like this really happened, and we're going to be very mundane. We're going to be very like attentive to making our details look as grounded in reality as possible. Or there's the other extreme where there's so much attention paid to the surreality of it, or the fantastical parts of it, that there's never any question of there even being any attempt to have it appear real at all. But this film, it's really weird the way they really inhabit that space between reality and fantasy, where, like I said, a lot of what's often foregrounded is very mundane, especially in the first and last segments. There's a lot of attention to making things sometimes look just very normal. Or you have scenes where, as I said, the foreground, what's happening in front of the screen, you know, what's happening close to the camera is very normal, and the set that's immediately like that you see, I mean, it's obviously in actuality a two-dimensional space, but if you're working with the illusion of a three-dimensional space, what your attention would normally be drawn to most, what's foregrounded, is often very just normal looking. But then in the background, like, you'll have this beautiful hand painted backdrop, like this totally, I mean, fake, yes, but this totally surreal looking sky or whatever. And it's just that combination of those things is really, it does something to you. It does something to help you, like, inhabit exactly the kind of world that myths and fairy tales exist in. One that is, on one level, definitely fake, but also feels real. I mean, it's that experience you get when you're reading a ghost story as a kid, where, like, this is fiction, but you get sucked in, and it disturbs you on some level, right? On some level, after you close the book, you're still inhabiting that world, and there's still the possibility, even though it's irrational, that something supernatural could happen, that a ghost could materialize. You're like, ooh, I don't really want to go in the bathroom alone now. Immediately after putting down a collection of ghosts, or at least, and this is an experience that most people have when they're very young or relatively young. Childhood, early adolescence. It's very easy to evoke that experience when you're young. Any silly ghost story will do it to you. Will suddenly take the safe, mundane world and transform it into something where something like horrifying and otherworldly can happen. That's a very hard feeling to wring out of someone when they're, a grizzled adult who has come to believe that, like, and rightfully so, that the supernatural is kind of bullshit. No offense, Brandon. I mean, but it's really hard to get back in that space. And for me, anyway, this movie, and I think the visuals are a big part of it, really grabbed me and pulled me back into that space.
Hmm.
But Rudy, Brandon, do you want to talk about the visuals?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with the stuff said about the backdrops, how they kind of take you and put you into that kind of half in the supernatural and half in the real world type of space. Um, that's one of the first things I noticed about the movie was the hand painted backgrounds that looked, like you said, unreal, I guess. And that's something that they visually, double down on throughout the whole movie is that. So
While we're talking about visuals, I'd like to mention the actors. I really liked how the actors basically all look like Japanese Hina dolls. Of they're all perfectly composed, and like
Mhm.
if you notice throughout the movie, some of the actors' faces just look unreal, almost like they've been almost as if they're wearing a mask, and I think some of that
mm,
effect was done through makeup.
Definitely through makeup, and the
yeah,
makeup work in
Yeah.
this is
It's spectacular.
fantastic.
It's on point. It's amazing, and the way that the actors themselves stay extremely still in some circumstances and don't entirely react to things in the way that you would expect real people to react.
yeah,
It's both somewhat like uncanny valley mannequin come to life type shit, and at the same time extremely Japanese.
Yeah, yeah, I totally agree with that. A lot is achieved through the acting. That once again, I think, I mean, I don't know when the phrase "uncanny valley" was coined, but it definitely, it may have been coined after this film was even made. But this film is definitely like a quintessential kind of uncanny valley experience throughout. B-boy, I want to get you in here though.
Yeah, for me is another thing that kind of calls back to that almost kabuki theater style
Yeah.
that
Yeah,
I did enjoy with the visual, especially when you had the almost grayed out faces of the ghosts and the paranormal elements to the film. It was so simple. It was gray chalk powder, but it was very effective.
mm,
And for me, that really was a big plus. Especially, like I said, I liked the fact that it felt like I was watching a play more than I was watching a movie.
Yeah, absolutely.
mm.
Anything anyone else wants to say about the visuals of this film before we move on? No? No. Okay. Does anyone have anything they want to talk about in the spoiler-free section of this podcast before we move on to reviews and spoilers? I'll admit, I spent. I actually don't have a hell of a lot to talk about as far as this movie is concerned. I think for two reasons. Reason number one is um, there are some movies that do so much in a space that's very difficult to describe, or that like film is a visual medium naturally, and some films like lend themselves to critique and analysis and dissection and debate. Some great films lend themselves well to those things, and some very bad films really lend themselves to those things too. And then you have some films that just don't, because they function so entirely on a visual level or a visceral level or both that they don't they're not necessarily made for discussion, they're made to be experienced. And I really feel like this film, which I do think is like a real masterpiece, is more of the latter. It doesn't necessarily lend itself to like thematic dissection or to like a fan theories or to like lots of puzzling over what the director was trying to do in any given moment.
Mhm.
But
Yeah.
it really works. It really gets you feeling things and gets you experiencing things. The second reason I don't have much to say is because I spent the whole afternoon playing Super Mario Odyssey, and I did not prepare for this podcast at all. I just didn't. Just fucking didn't.
And
And I
you want to end it so you can get back to
I
playing
want to
Super
go
Mario.
back to playing Super
Uh,
Mario. Are you talking about things that bring you back into that space that you could only feel in childhood? Jesus Christ. It's like, oh my god, excited about a video game. I mean, that's
So we're just gonna talk about Super Mario Odyssey now, aren't we?
no, I'm not. I'm not going to, unless we start a. Maybe we should fuck it. Let's stop doing film podcasts and do video game podcasts. Uh,
that sounds expensive.
yeah, that's true. You can't really rent games or obtain games totally legally over the internet the way you can with movies.
Well, I mean, we could just do indie games that are free.
Yeah, that's true.
free
That's
to play
true.
ones. I know which one I'm choosing.
But anyway, for better or for worse, we're in the middle of a
Oh,
film
God.
podcast right now. So,
Yes, we are.
um,
We
so
Yeah,
yeah,
I would
I'm
agree with you.
opening
Like,
up to you guys.
we should just go
I
to
would agree
the
with you. This is
spoiler version.
Well, I think we should let Brandon talk, AJ.
No.
Yeah.
Don't you get
Well, I
the
was going to
message?
say I agree with you in a minute.
God damn it! Shut up! You're just so
Really? No.
okay. I was sorry, Brandon. What were you saying?
As I've tried to say twice now, I agree with you. This is definitely one of those movies that kind of defies explanation in a lot of ways. I mean, it's one of those movies I don't really have anything negative that I can say, and it's hard to really say anything positive other outside of commenting on the visual, because it is such a one of those things where movies should at times be an experience unto themselves. Kwaidan kind of delivers on that, as long as you're in the right mindset to sit down and to let it absorb.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
True. Rudy?
Nope, I don't have anything else to say. I'm ready for the spoilers section.
Yeah, I kind of really one thing about this is because of the way it's structured and because the vignettes are so short and because so much that happens in them is in some ways if not revealed at the beginning, foreshadowed very heavily by the setup. So much of what we could potentially be talking about is a spoiler. So what I would like to do when we go into the spoiler section is take each segment one by one and talk about them. But I don't want to do that now. So
Yeah.
maybe well, AJ, did you have anything?
Nope.
No? Well, then I think this is the fastest we've ever made it to, especially once we cut out. We've got a few, parts that we'll need to cut out because of technical issues. But once we cut those out, I think that this will be one of the fastest. We're pretty much record time here arriving at the reviews section,
Yeah.
but that's fine. Who wants to go first with their review of the film?
Well, I think it's fair that you go first since you chose the film.
Well, usually I go fast. Go fast. Yeah, usually I go fast. Just warning you. I don't have much endurance or stamina. Damn it.
Oh, you got to leave that part in.
Yeah, oh yeah, I will. You think I have any shame? But generally speaking, I structure this so that I always go last.
Because he thinks his opinion is most important.
But okay, I'll go first. I will go first this time.
Oh, you think you're so important you get to go first?
You know what, AJ? Fuck you. You're going first then.
Okay. It's a really good movie. I enjoyed all of it. It's so beautiful, and don't expect to be too scared unless you're a pussy like Will. But like the stories were still very entertaining and interesting, so it was definitely worth the time. A really good Halloween movie, but also a really good any time of the year movie. I'd give it 9 out of 10 vultures.
Wow, 9 out of 10 vultures. Is that the highest score you've ever given any, or did you give Black Pond 10 out of 10?
I forget.
You may have given Black Pond 10 out of 10, but still, it's a pretty respectable score for you. Yeah. So, I can hear myself being fed back again.
I don't hear it.
Test. Oh, I don't hear it anymore. Damn it. AJ, unmute your microphone. Test. Hey. God damn it.
Oh, it must be me. I don't. Oh wait, I hear it actually.
Yeah, you do?
Yeah.
I think it's AJ.
Oh,
But she's muted though. How is that even possible?
She wasn't muted. Mute yourself, AJ. Can you hear it now?
Test. Nope, I don't.
No.
AJ, just go on, and I'll keep mine muted.
Yeah, that's probably the best thing to do. You can just mute and unmute when you're talking. Okay. So I guess I'll go next then. So honestly, I think this film's a masterpiece. I think this is the best horror movie I've ever seen. I think this is the best movie about folklore that I've ever seen. I think this movie is one of the best examples of a film that cultivates its own universe in a really unique and wonderful way. I think it's the most visually stunning film I've ever seen, once again, with the possible exception of some of Tarkovsky's work. And God damn it, even though you guys disagree with me, I think this is also possibly the scariest film that I've ever seen. And for all those reasons, I give it 5 out of 5 vultures. Brandon?
Okay. Well, let me preface it with the bad, and then I'll get to the good. I'm not a fan of foreign movies. Personally, for me, I like to get myself wrapped up in a movie so I can watch and enjoy the visuals while listening to the actors and just embracing everything that they have to say, getting every piece of dialogue. I hate subtitles because for me, the subtitles distract from enjoying the visual. And in a movie like Kwaidan, which is such the term, but it's so appropriate in this case, such a visual smorgasbord
Yeah.
of things to enjoy, so much to take in. And I feel like if I actually spoke Japanese, and this is the only time people will ever hear me say this, if I actually spoke Japanese, I feel like I would have enjoyed this movie so much more because I wouldn't have had that distraction.
Yeah. One thing I'd recommend is going through and maybe watching it a second time, because the plot, first of all, the subtitles here are not that intrusive because there really isn't that much dialogue in this movie. And once you've watched it once, you could almost turn the subtitles off and just watch it without even reading it and just know what's happening.
It would definitely be easy enough to follow along. But I mean, that's a very small, minor point, and that's more of a personal preference thing for me. Right. Even if there was a dubbed version somewhere, which I don't think would be all that hard, because like you said, there isn't that much dialogue.
Well, let's not go down that rabbit hole.
I know, dangerous territory. Fine with some of the narration, though. The dialogue is one thing, because of course you want to have the voices sync up with the actors, but for the narration, I feel like if that had been dubbed, narration did happen when so much visually was going on. Narration was a detraction there because of the subtitles, because I was trying to follow along with what plot points they're giving out in this narrative dialogue. It's like, oh, I want to follow all of this. I want to absorb all of this. But then what am I missing up in that top corner of the screen? What am I missing over here?
Right.
That was...
Not to interrupt Brandon once again, but I would like to mention that I do know a bit of Japanese, and though I didn't get all of it, I was able to understand, like, a portion of it. And I did find that some of the subtitles were a bit liberal in their translation, if they didn't directly apply, which was kind of interesting for me. But the subtitles were very non-intrusive. I usually find subtitles somewhat hard to deal with in movies as well, but this one in particular seemed very easy because, like Will said, there wasn't too much dialogue.
Boy, guys, the next film I'm going to pick is going to be a Bergman. I've got to do it now, just because I know how much you guys dislike subtitles. If I can get Brandon and AJ, geez.
But is that going to be in Swedish?
Oh, do you know Swedish?
I know a bit of Swedish too.
What?
So that'll also be fun. I can talk about how I know a bit of Swedish and I'm better than Will. And that'll be my satisfaction. So don't worry.
Well, you know what? We're done with the podcast. This is the last episode, guys. Just making AJ feel good about herself. We don't want that.
Yeah, that's not good. No, that's not what misery tourism is all about. This is not about self-satisfaction.
All right. Anyway, back to Brandon's review.
Yeah, back to the review. Yeah, I aside from those small quibbles of not really enjoying the foreign film and subtitle aspect, and aside from what I mentioned about the pacing issues, and I'll get more into why the pacing issues were rough for me in the next half. It was really a solid film, visually stunning, The folklore element was great. Like I said, it felt like I was watching Grimm's fairy tales because there are a lot of parallels in the Japanese folklore versus what the Brothers Grimm set forth in Europe. Um, so I would give this a solid 4 out of 5 vultures.
Wow, I'm shocked, B-boy. I honestly thought you
Yeah.
were going to either hate this movie or just like grudgingly accept its existence. That's a pretty that's way more than I expected.
And that's with almost falling asleep watching this 4 times.
Yeah. We'll have to talk a little bit about which segment you almost fell asleep
Yeah,
on in the
yeah.
next part because I have a feeling that I think when we get into the spoilers, we'll talk about our favorite
Mhm.
ones. And maybe, yeah. And then I think, because I think that my choice might be a little bit, I think there might be some disagreement there.
There
Rudy,
might be.
your review.
Well, okay, so the visually stunning movie, uh, the hand painted backdrops and all that are great. Certainly, the sound is one thing that I didn't mention before, but that was something that really struck me. And I think the
Yeah.
sound may actually be better than the visuals for me, anyway.
I'm really
That,
glad you mentioned that because I wanted to bring that up and I just didn't at all. Aside from one of the segments where I think the sound is just a little too intrusive or just a little bit gets a little bit too much into like jump scare territory.
right.
It gets I thought the sound design in this was fucking amazing, and really just the like. In some cases, there's music, but it's really minimalistic. It's almost like this
Yeah.
really modern, like like very ultra minimalistic music, and it will be totally absent, and then it will come in, and it will come in this very subtle and very effective way. Why don't you talk a little bit about why you like the sound?
Well, one thing I liked is the little ricky tick tick sounds they make, like almost like skeleton sounds, I guess they'd be.
Yeah.
But um, a lot of those, and the way they pace them throughout especially throughout the first film there,
Yes.
the first one, it came in a really, I guess, powerful, not shocking, but really kind of scary way, I guess.
There is something that happens, and I don't want to. I'll save this for the spoiler part. But the way you were thinking of exactly the same thing as I was. The way they use sound, especially in the last part of the first segment, is really it's
Yeah.
fucking brilliant in like unbelievable ways. But
Mm.
yeah, I totally agree with you.
Yep. Yeah, I mean the sound, like I said, the sound is great. Visuals are great. The dialogue is not bad. I mean, for I one thing I really choke on with movies is the dialogue, and I didn't choke at all during this one, so I guess that's a plus.
It's unintrusive,
It's unintrusive. Yeah, I mean it's not realistic, but it's unintrusive. I mean that's cool. I mean it's doing what it needs to do.
right?
Overall, I really like this movie. I did not really expect to get much out of it aesthetically when because I just looked at a couple of screenshots of it before I watched the movie, but aesthetically it's a pretty beautiful movie. So I would say, excuse me, for reviews, I'd say I would give it 2 out of 2 bombs dropped from the Enola Gay.
That was a lot of build up for that
Oh.
punchline, man.
Oh,
God damn
oh wow.
it. At least it got both bombs.
They got both bombs, so
Damn.
I mean there you go.
Does it get the fucking oh my god.
Okay, well, 2 of 2 mushroom clouds then, I
Okay.
guess. How about we put it at that?
I said I now does it get the third bomb that they would have dropped on Tokyo if General
Oh, if John von Neumann
If,
had his way.
if John von Neumann had his way, yeah.
I mean, sure, yeah, we'll give it 3 of 2. We'll give it 2 of 2 bombs dropped from the Enola Gay and the ghost bomb, that John von Neumann wanted to drop.
Yeah. Oh yeah, it was MacArthur wanted to nuke Korea, right? Not he didn't want to drop a third. The MacArthur was the one I was thinking of, but he didn't
okay.
want to drop a third. You're right. It was John von Neumann who wanted
Yeah, I mean,
third.
since that was about obliterating Japanese culture. I mean, this is such a prime example of Japanese culture. You have to give it
Right.
that extra bomb. So.
Right. Um. So.
And better yet, it's pre-World War II Japanese culture before they started getting into all the weird shit that they're putting out now.
Oh yeah.
Although this film was made,
Yeah, it was made in 1965.
so it was made
Yeah.
well, maybe not well after. I mean, if we had just suffered from nuclear devastation 15 years ago, we probably wouldn't say that's well in the past. But this was reasonably. Certainly, this was.
But it was
during,
traditional culture.
Yeah, I mean, what's being presented on screen is traditional culture. Although I think we could talk a little bit about the modern lens through which at least a couple of these is being interpreted, I think. But anyway, so let's move on then to our spoiler inclusive segment.
All right, I had to run to the bathroom, so.
Okay, great. I'll give my little spiel
I
about.
also have to do that.
So now's the time. If you're planning to watch this film, and it is a long film, but maybe pause the podcast, keep it open in a browser window, watch the film, maybe take a couple of days even to watch the film. Watch. There is an intermission midway through the film, so watch the first half, take a break, watch the second half. If you have time to watch it, if AJ does her job and this podcast comes out before Halloween, maybe you can even watch it on Halloween. But anyway, hold on and keep this podcast open somewhere, and then once you watch the movie, come back to it, because now we're going to talk about the movie in a way that will contain spoilers. It might ruin your experience, and this is a good movie to go into fresh. So that said, so now we wait. AJ, you can unmute your mic if you're even here.
I'm not.
Okay. Hey, Mr. Bones.
I decided to check out and go play Mario Odyssey.
AJ, you don't have Mario Odyssey.
That's what you think.
You wish you had Mario Odyssey. Everyone wishes they had Mario Odyssey. This podcast brought to you by Mario Odyssey.
I don't wish that I had Mario Odyssey. I'm okay not having it.
Sponsored by Nintendo.
Yeah. Man, I wish. Jesus. No, we're just doing all this
Sponsored by
advertising
Nintendo,
for free.
as Rudy is talking about.
Yeah.
Brought to us by Nintendo, as Rudy is talking about the nuclear bombs dropped on Japan.
Yeah. Boy. Oh boy.
I like how when Rudy's mic is muted and you can see the dog's mouth moving.
Yeah, that's fucking. So is he saying something? I wonder.
You know that like
He
some
must be.
noises are doing, like it's
Yeah.
either noises or talking.
Damn, that's disturbing.
Chair squeaks coming out of that dog's mouth.
So
God, that dog is just so unnerving.
What's this?
just the
Yeah,
dog's
that
mouth was still
unnerving.
moving while you were gone.
Oh, was it?
Yeah, it was just a little, just subtly, just enough to fucking be creepy.
Interesting.
I mean, not that it's not creepy enough when it's moving because you're talking, but
Yeah.
are we ready to go?
Yep.
Okay, so
Ready.
um okay, so I think what I want to do first off in this second half is to ask each of you which of the four films you think you enjoyed the most and which you thought was the scariest. I know some of you weren't scared at all by the movie, but which you think was the most effective at being scary and which you think was the most effective, period, or just your favorite, period. And then after we do that, we'll take the movies one by one in the order they appear in the film. We'll talk about the segments, excuse me, one by one in the order that they appear in the film. We'll talk about them maybe briefly, maybe at length. And then once we've talked about all of them, we'll call it a day, and I'll go back to playing Mario Odyssey.
Yep.
Uh, you guys can really experience horror because apparently you're going to play a game of League of Legends. Which,
Yep.
um, okay, so uh, starting with AJ. AJ, what was your which film did you think which film, which segment, which vignette did you think was scariest, and which one was your favorite?
Okay, so I would say that I think the last one was the scariest because that was the only one that I felt like actual tension during that one. Um, like it didn't
The, just to
really.
interrupt, the last one is In a Cup of Tea. That's the name of it.
Yes,
Okay. So you think In a Cup of Tea was the scariest
I
one?
think In a Cup of Tea was the scariest. I'm having difficulty thinking of which one was my favorite. I think I think definitely the second one was my favorite visually, but I wasn't so keen on the story of that one. I really liked the first one and how, like you said, they used sound, and
Mm.
I enjoyed the story and effects in that one. But the third one was just really good overall. I think I would have to say I think I would have to say that my favorite was the first one
Oh, really? That's interesting.
on just like a sort of visceral level. Um, and then the third one, and then the second one, but they're pretty close. And I'm not sure how the fourth one fits in. It's like extremely hard to rank these. Not gonna lie, but yeah, I'd definitely say the fourth one was the scariest, and I think the first one was my favorite.
Okay, great. Um, Brandon.
Uh, I think I would agree that the fourth was the scariest, probably because it had the least time to build to the conclusion. I think that was the shortest of the four vignettes, and correct me if I'm wrong on that. But I feel like that one had the fastest build from and the phrasing and the framing of the story to the actual payoff of.
Yeah, I'm pretty confident that the last one, if we're talking about length, the third vignette is definitely the longest one. I think that one
Oh,
is
by far.
close to maybe not a full hour, but it's well over 45 minutes long.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I believe the last one is only like 20 some minutes, maybe half an hour. And the first and second one fall in between.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's certainly the shortest one.
Yeah. And personally, my favorite would be the second vignette. The what is it? Woman in Winter, I believe,
The Woman of the
was
Snow.
the Woman of the Snow. That was my favorite of the four.
Really? That's interesting.
Yeah, I felt like like I said, I'm such a big fan of folklore and that Grimm's fairy tale presentation. And to me, I felt like The Woman of the Snow was just spot on as far as pacing, the actual plot itself, where the payoff came, where everything fell into place with that one
Yeah.
vignette.
And
For me, that was
what the
perfect.
payoff is too. uh,
Even though
yeah,
I saw it coming halfway through the vignette, the eventual payoff was just perfect.
yeah. And not even the big reveal. Well, we'll talk about this later, but not even the big reveal, which, as you said, pretty much is 100% telegraphed, as I think it should be. But how the characters respond after the big reveal, I think, really elevates that segment.
Yeah, yeah,
Uh,
absolutely.
but Rudy, which one you
Yeah,
think did you think was the scariest, and which one was your favorite?
yeah, I think the scariest one, hands down, is the first one. Like I said, because of the use of the sound and that stuff. That was definitely the most frightening to me, anyway. Um, my favorite one is probably either the third or the fourth one. Hochi the Earless, I think, is the name of
Hoichi?
one.
I don't know. Let's have AJ
Hoichi,
try to pronounce it.
yeah,
AJ
It's definitely Hoichi.
Hoichi. Okay.
Hoichi. Okay, I will. So yeah, so Yasuo the Earless, or In a Cup of Tea would be my favorite ones. I think I'd have to go with the Hoichi one as a
Mm,
favorite, but the other one's a pretty close second.
okay. Great. And I actually I half agree with Rudy and I half agree with Brandon. I think for me the scariest one, the one that really fucked me up, was the first one, the black hair. And as Rudy said, a lot of that is because of the way it uses sound during that final sequence of the film. Also, the way that I won't say twist because it's not a twist because we know exactly where it's going basically from minute one. But the way that final reveal, or that final, basically when he realizes, the scene where he realizes that his wife is dead, the way that plays out is fucking terrifying, and the
Hmm.
makeup work and stuff after that
Yeah.
is fucking woo. That
Hmm.
that one really fucking terrified me. I do think that In a Cup of Tea was the only other one in the series, in the four segments, that really was a scary story, at least in a more traditional sense. So that's probably the second scariest. But the black hair just was really, that was the one that got me. That was the one that kept me up after I watched it. Um, Although the very last scene of In a Cup of Tea is creepy as shit too. My favorite though is The Woman of the Snow, for a lot of reasons. Just everything about that, I think,
Mhm.
Hmm.
excels. And we can talk about it when we talk about that one. So let's talk about the black hair then, the first vignette, the first ghost story. Um, and fuck it, let's talk about the sound because everyone keeps talking about the sound. Um,
Yeah, yeah.
uh, the sound in this segment is incredible. Does anyone want to say anything about that before I go on a diatribe, before I like rant about it for 20 minutes? Rudy, you
No,
seem to.
I think this is yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. It's just there's something about the sound of those kendo sticks or whatever it was hitting together that just that made it really frightening and also somehow played up the visuals too, because the way they cut the edits and stuff like that, and use that with the sound was pretty interesting.
Yeah, yeah. There's
Oh,
this cracking,
yeah,
which maybe is kendo sticks, or there's this like auditory, this really abrasive like I can't make the noise, but like clucking, like cracking, like noise that
yeah,
appears. And actually, it's kind of in the beginning of the film a little bit. This very like um these very subtle auditory cues, but they really kick in an amazing way at the end of the film when he's reunited with his wife, but before he realizes that she's deceased. When he's basically having his little rendezvous, his reconciliation with his ghost wife.
yeah,
And just throughout that whole sequence, which um, superficially is this really tender scene, right? But every once in a while you hear that, right?
yeah,
And, just,
yep,
and you're like, boy, and that just sets you on edge. And you
yeah,
just know something is going to happen, you know? And
right,
it's almost subconscious. Like it just
mhm,
builds up
Hmm.
to that moment that you know is coming. And so the first time I watched this film, it was just that like sense of escalating dread when I was hearing that. Uh, But the second time I watched it, knowing where it's going, when I heard those cues again, and they happen during scenes when he's like holding her, or he like brings her close to him, and
mhm,
and you realize, at least I think, that that could be that, since she is in fact a desiccated corpse, that could be the sound of her physically breaking down. Those could be her bones
yeah,
snapping as he holds her during those
yep,
moments of tender reconciliation. And Jesus, just thinking about that, I mean, it could also be a kind of, it could try to evoke the way the house is falling apart too. There's a
yeah,
scene afterwards when he steps on a board when he's in the like destroy the ruins of his house after the
mhm,
glamour or the illusion is broken, and you hear it crack, and it's the same kind of noise. So that could have been and you can see there's in their like bedroom where they were lying on the floor, like in the illusion it was like it looked just like it must have been old days, like everything was pristine and perfect. But once the illusion breaks, there's this hollowed out section of the floor where her body is lying, and where the boards have all given way, and it's not clear,
mhm,
like, was it already that way, or did that happen during the
yeah,
night? And so you realize that sound, that that clicking, clacking, whatever, that little subtle intrusive noise was an indication of what was really happening all along. And I just think that's like great. Yeah.
Yeah,
yeah,
it's such a great subtle auditory punctuation,
Yeah.
mhm,
because that was really how that felt to me. Was that's the punctuation mark on every visual statement being made in that story.
Yeah.
mhm.
uh AJ, did you want to get in on the sound?
Um, basically, I agree with everything that's been said, and that's it.
Awesome. uh here's a question: how do you guys feel about this film as an introduction to this collection, to this anthology, as the first film?
I think that was definitely a good jumping off point. I feel like that really introduced you to what they were planning on doing with the rest of the of footage that was going to follow. Um, I think it's definitely one way to ease you in, and at the same time deliver a good amount of that tension and really let you know that this isn't going to be a walk in the park to enjoy. This isn't going to be a walk in the park to just sit through and watch. It's going to be something that's going to demand your attention and make you pay attention one way or another, whether it's by keeping you enthralled with these great visuals or by really just hitting you over the head with that sound.
Yeah.
Like the minute you get distracted, that sound just pulls you back in.
Yeah.
And I think that was just really well executed.
Right. AJ, Rudy, about this film as an introduction to the anthology as the first film or the first segment.
I think the order of it was really well done. I think it's interesting that they sort of framed the movie with the two scariest ones.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, the last one definitely belonged in last place, and I feel like the first one definitely belonged in the first place.
Yeah, I agree.
The middle two also seemed to belong very well where they were situated. Just the sort of like the rhythm of the movie as a whole seems better with the breaks that they've inserted.
Yeah.
And the first one does a really good job at kicking everything off. It's also one of the more, like Brandon said, more demanding, but also like more obviously scary stories. So it kind of draws you in. Whereas if, the second one had been first, people might have possibly tuned out.
Rudy?
I think visually it's a really good introduction to the techniques and stuff they're using in the film. But thematically, I think it's kind of maybe intentionally misleading as far as what the rest of the film is about, because it's it's this typical scary story when the other ones really aren't. Even the last one isn't really like a typical, like like, well, holy shit, he's sleeping with a dead body type of story.
Right. Yeah, I kind of agree with you there. I do think that this is a great introduction to the film exactly for that reason, because this is a very traditional ghost story. It's a very traditional Eastern ghost story. It's a very traditional Western ghost story. This is almost like the quintessential ghost story. And because it's not quite as weird as some of the later films, it's a really good point of entry, I think, to the other films or the other segments or vignettes in the anthology. I also think that it. Oh, sorry, what was that?
It was very accessible.
Yeah, it's probably
because
the
of
most.
that.
Yeah, exactly. It probably is the most accessible film. I also think that there's this weird thing in terms of like style that happens in this movie, or in terms of like the degree to which they commit to the like aesthetic extremes of this movie, like the hand painted backdrops and the heavy makeup work and all of that. An interesting thing about this film or this segment is that it's actually very subdued in that respect for the most part. It's still gorgeous looking, but the like sort of surreal backdrops only pop up, I think, maybe twice in the film in a very subtle way. Um, the kind of haunted house that appears in this segment is really atmospheric, but it's not particularly like weird and supernatural looking. And so I think in that way, it brings it start you start this collection almost in the real world. And then by the end of this film, you've kind of entered into the realm of the supernatural, into the realm of folklore. And this film kind of guides you there by seeming more mundane, by seeming, I mean, nothing supernatural occurs in this film until the very end, which is not true of the other films in the collection, which generally open
Mhm.
with the ghost in one way or another. This movie, the ghost doesn't appear until in this vignette, the ghost doesn't appear until the very end. We know where it's going because we've heard stories like this before, but
Mhm.
it doesn't become a ghost story until its last few minutes. And I think because of that, this is kind of like the journey into the woods, right? This is you start out in a familiar place at the beginning of the movie, and by the end of the first segment, you're in a deeply unfamiliar place, and so you're prepared for the movies, for the short films, for the segments, for the stories that come after it. Um, Anything else?
I've I've got to bring up the incredible makeup work in those last few minutes of this story,
Yeah,
Mm.
with the way that the protagonist just starts to age,
I know.
crumbling. That was one of the most magnificent things I have seen done in films in a long, long time. Because the transformation was so gradual over so many of the jump cuts, it was just masterful.
That's true. I mean, it a gradual on one sense, but also so extreme in the other. Where by the last
Yeah,
scene,
yeah.
he looks like he's 80 years old. Uh, and the way that they start by making his skin so pale, and then they start with
Mhm.
taking his hair out, and they just it is pretty impressive. And to think that all of that was done without the help of any kind of it's all done with makeup. There's no computer assisted graphic work here. It's just
Yeah.
all 100% makeup.
Yeah, it's a testament to the value of practical effects, and that's something that you hear about so often in a lot of filmmakers even today, that can accomplish so much that computer generated work just can't even begin to touch. And that was such a perfect example of that, because if that was being done with CGI, you would have that awful young Princess Leia in Rogue One uncanny valley effect happening. You have
Yeah.
a cartoon character sitting across from live human beings, and you know that something is very, very wrong with this.
Right. It would be the wrong
They're
kind
trying,
of uncanny. Yeah, it would be the
yeah,
wrong
the
kind of
very much
uncanny
wrong
valley,
kind.
not the right kind of uncanny valley, which is where this film sort
Yeah,
of dwells.
yeah.
On a related note, I have to talk about the visual of his dead wife and the three shots. Well, I mean, if he kind of breaks down both quickly and slowly over the course of the last couple minutes of the film, the way that it cuts to her first and she's this kind of
Mhm.
desiccated mummy, and then it cuts to her again and she's a skeleton, and then it cuts to
Yeah.
her and she's gone. She's just
Yeah.
hair. That I thought that was a really tremendous visual effect,
Yeah, yeah.
and really authentically scary in a way that a lot of bodies in films aren't authentically scary. um, Also, about that moment, this film does something that I really like, and it does it a couple of times. If this was a contemporary horror film, it would have he would have woken up and he would have like looked over at her and maybe pulled the blanket aside, and it would have quickly cut to an image of her dead, like, oh, and it would have been a jump scare. But this movie does everything it can to deny that jump scare, because what it actually does is, first there's a slow buildup of him removing the blanket, and then we see him react, and we watch him react before we see her. And I think that's
Mhm.
cool because it, as I said, what's amazing is see him act horrified, and which would generally be a pretty big no-no, because then whatever visual you see has to live up to that expectation. But the
Mm.
amazing thing is the visual does live up to that. But also it doesn't, it's so just not cheap to do it that way, right? The cheap thing to do is to show someone something horrific when they're not expecting it and spook them, get them to jump. And the
But
fact that it does everything it can to prepare us for what
Mhm.
it shows us, and the thing it shows us still makes your skin crawl, I
yeah,
think is spectacular.
yeah, definitely.
Anything else? AJ, you haven't really. Did you want to get in on any of this?
Uh, I agree. I appreciate that it's not cheap. It's very not cheap. It shows you the reactions before it shows the effects. Um, I will say that the when it does show you the dead wife, I wasn't like it didn't really make my skin crawl.
Really?
The
Hmm.
one image from that story that did stick with me was like um when he exited the house as he was trying to run away from like his wife's hair
Oh
and
yeah,
and he turns around and like the hair is positioned in the air as if
yeah,
it's looking at him, and that I think that would be the closest it, the movie got to really getting under my skin.
Huh. Yeah, that was a great visual. I will say there is one, just because I don't want, I don't want people to think this film is totally above reproach and critique. There is one small visual effect in that final sequence that doesn't work, or at least hasn't aged well, and that's after he sees her. There's a moment where like a little clump of hair jumps at him, and,
yeah, yeah,
and
Yeah,
that ends up being a little
yeah.
funnier than it is scary.
yeah,
Um,
I
Yeah,
think I
yeah.
laughed aloud during that. There's a couple times where like the hair is like going for his throat, and you just can't help but laugh. It's just kind of funny.
it's
yeah.
maybe a little overdone, but considering everything else, I still think this is a pretty scary
I
segment.
think what I enjoyed the most about this first vignette is how it dovetails into the genre of body horror.
Mm,
Actually seeing, like you said, watching the dead wife go from being the mummy to the skeleton to the nothingness. I mean, that's creepy enough, but watching the rapid deterioration of the protagonist, for me, I think was one of the most effective types of horror that you can really run into in a movie, because you're not necessarily expecting that.
right.
As you get to the point where he's reconnecting with the first wife, you kind of know just from the general tone, okay, there's going to be bad shit's about to go down. This isn't going to be a happy ending, because it's not that kind of story. And you
Yeah.
can kind of mentally prepare yourself for watching the wife deteriorate into nothingness and to actually have been dead the whole time. To actually watch the protagonist go through that transformation as well, I think that was more viscerally jarring for me
Yeah,
than anything else, and that's a fantastic thing.
yeah, I totally agree. Um, One thing that I want to talk about here, and I kind of wish I had brought this up in the first half, because I think it's one of the major themes of the film, and I think it's one of the things that the film does really effectively, is the way in which this movie um, makes the ghosts very human. and in some ways also makes some of the humans ghostly. Like it is really good at blurring the line between death and undeath, between the living and the dead, or between the natural and the supernatural. Like so many films about ghosts do everything they can to make the ghost scary and almost nothing to make the ghost human, even though they were apparently human at one point. They just like usually the ghost is either very like some kind of abstract killing machine or some kind of abstract source of horror, some kind of unknowable like thing, or they're reduced to a very simple motivation like, you know, this ghost wants revenge on the person who killed her, and you know, or maybe she wants revenge on anyone who looks somewhat like the person. You know, it's always like this ghost is out for revenge. This ghost is sad because whatever, you know, tragic backstory, yada yada yada. You know, they're all reduced to just this one like little point. They never have the richness of an actual human character, but all of the ghosts in this movie, all the supernatural beings in this movie are remarkably like complete, nuanced, human seeming beings, you know? And that was one of the things that really jumped out to me in this first segment is during that reconciliation scene with his wife, so much of the attention is not just on his feelings, but on her feelings. And it makes you wonder, you know, how much of her old pathologies, how much of her old like it's really interesting how desperate she is during that scene for reconciliation, right? Almost like how willing she is to just accept him back.
Yeah.
And then how vengeful the hair ghost seems to be at the end, you know, like it just it's so complex there, and it's such there's like that really interesting dichotomy between like her, obviously her craving, like why has she been sticking around for all this time, right? Why is she still inhabiting that house? Why is her spirit still there? And that's really something that so many ghost stories are about, and the answer is usually so pat and so superficial in ghost stories, but by really fleshing her out and giving her that long reconciliation sequence with him, and then undercutting it later by just how malicious the hair is, like that I thought was really effective. And then, of course, his transformation at the end into something that's not quite human anymore, or that seems more like maybe a ghost than a human, is a kind of blurring of the line in the opposite direction.
Yeah, definitely.
Anyone want to say anything else about this segment before we move on to the next one?
No, I think I'm good with that one.
Nope. Fine.
Okay, let's talk about the women. The woman of the snow, which is the second segment, which is about a young guy who has an encounter with some kind of, I'm not sure if she's a ghost or if she's some kind of otherworldly spirit, but anyway, he has an encounter with a some kind of supernatural being who basically appears in the form of a young beautiful woman and who can kill men with her breath, who can basically freeze men to death with her breath. And he has this horrifying encounter with her, and then later he ends up marrying her and having a happy marriage with her, and then until he reveals until he tells her the story of how until he unknowingly tells her the story of how they met, which is really a fascinating sort of thing. But anyway, how did you guys feel about this one? I want to give you guys a chance to talk about it before I talk about why it's my favorite.
This one for me, like I said, this was the most perfect of those fairy tale moments, those folk tale moments. want to say that she was some form of nature spirit in line with the whole concept of if you tell anyone about this,
I'll come back and
that's
kill you.
that's a classic archetype. That's a classic trope. And it's a classic because it's such a functional thing and a functional allegory for nature in and of itself that
Hmm.
act with nature will fuck you up.
Yeah.
That's like a in all of these classic tales in anything dealing with mythology in general. Because of course mythology and folk tales in general were designed to explain aspects of nature that we as humans hadn't quite grasped yet.
Right,
So
exactly.
having that unknowable force of nature take an interest in a human, that's a classic. That's something you see in the European folk tales, you see it in Greek mythology, you see it so frequently. And I
Yeah.
think this one really just hit that niche in that aspect.
Mhm.
AJ, Rudy. Um, let's start with AJ.
I love this one visually. It's absolutely stunning. The scene where there were eyes in the snowy forest.
Yeah.
That that's gonna stick with me like for a very long time. Like that's like an experience itself, just seeing that scene. Um, the story I wasn't actually so fond of. Um, it was very predictable fairy tale. It was very predictable fairy tale story, and you could definitely see where it was going. The payoff was somewhat subversive. I didn't completely expect that, but overall, it just didn't engage me too much.
Rudy.
All right, so I've looked at pictures of Undertale fan art, the ones with the where the skeleton has a big erect penis, and that informed the way I viewed this, and that informed what I'm gonna say. So I'll just get that out of the way.
Sure.
Oh
Um,
boy.
I think that a lot of this was, well, the way it came across to me anyway. A lot of it had to do with maybe a sexual obsession with the supernatural,
Huh,
which
that's interesting. Let's say more. Tell me more about that.
well, I mean, first of all, when the guy first encounters a ghost, he's with his mentor, the older man, who then dies, and you might say that he at that time was kind of like still a boy and not a man or whatever, in that sense.
Yeah,
And
there's a
that's
real
kind of
coming
like,
of age kind of thing going on here.
yeah, yep, and that kind of that was that encounter with the ghost. It's almost like like
His
a
first
stand-in
wet
for like a
dream.
sex, yeah, or a wet dream or the first sexual encounter, kind of.
Yeah.
Um, and then when the ghost when, and then the way she says, don't tell anyone ever about this. Don't tell anyone. Don't don't talk about this. It's almost like like an abuse situation. It seems like to me,
Yeah.
because
Huh.
especially where she then later, when he's telling her the story, and he's like, and then he catches shit for it. He catches supernatural shit for retelling the story of it. It's like it seems to enforce that, hey, don't talk about this, type of thing. But at the same time, he's still very attracted to this ghost
Yeah.
that he you know
To the point where when she comes back masquerading as a human, like he's immediately drawn to her.
right.
And you're right that this is a very, like, this is a much more sexual story than the first one, even though they're both about relationships. And you can even see it in the first scene when he meets her, well, one of the first scenes after he meets her as a quote unquote human, like there's that weird like erotic leg washing scene where he's like fixate, like he's watching her wash her legs and her feet, and that is, and then of course this is the only scene in the collection, the only story or vignette in the anthology that contains an actual sex scene, which is interesting. But I think you're definitely right that there's this kind of ghost story as erotic metaphor thing going on here. But I sorry to interrupt you. You can pick up. I think you have your mic muted though, Rudy. So if you're saying something, we can't hear you. Uh huh. Oh, I see. So, um, anyone want to get in on Rudy's sort of theory of this
I
segment
think
as
that's
a sort of coming of
I think
age
that's
sex story?
definitely an interesting take on it. That's definitely not something that I would have gone to with as my go-to explanation for what was going on in the story, but I think that definitely it makes sense in a weird way. There's definitely an element of that fixation and that dangerous attraction element, which I think does also play into the whole concept of that pact with nature that you can't really avoid. You feel drawn to it for some reason, and you don't necessarily understand why.
Yeah.
So that's a very interesting take on it.
Yeah, I think that's I really I didn't think that, at least not in that exact way when I was watching it, but I do think that does a lot to explain what's going on here. And certainly that moment, that moment of transition from adolescence into adulthood is huge for ghost stories.
Mm.
You know, it and
Oh, definitely.
like how many different movies do the ghosts serve as a sort of metaphor for puberty? You know, or even like, and there's all this stuff in folklore about like poltergeist phenomena manifesting itself during puberty, like, and like how many slasher films are about high school students, you know, or college students, and in how many horror films is sexuality either foregrounded or backgrounded in a significant way? I
Mm.
think definitely. As far as my feeling about the film is concerned, first of all, I want to double down on what AJ said, which is this is, I think, possibly the most beautiful segment in a really beautiful film.
Oh,
The
definitely.
blizzard sequence in the beginning with the painted eyes in the, as someone else mentioned, in the sky. But all of the skies in this movie are unbelievable. There's one really fucked up moment uh, in the film where, first of all, the sky is this tremendous, like yellowish orange mixed with like blackish brown color that frankly to me looked like a Rothko painting, and the rest of you may not think that's a compliment, but since I'm a huge Rothko fan, I was like, Rothko sky. But on top of that, there's this pair of like piercing eyes in the sky, and it's framed in a way so that he's facing towards the camera so he can't see them, and it's this really fucking like messed up moment. And it's one of those moments where the film is, if we didn't know already, the film is very clearly informing us of the connection between her and this, you know, blizzard spirit that he met at the beginning of the film. But it's also showing us how completely clueless he is, right? Because he's facing us, he doesn't see it, but we can see the huge eyes in the
Yeah.
sky looking at him, and that was just a really effective moment, I thought. Uh, But the thing I loved about this, and why it kind of ranks number one for me, is I think that this is like an incredibly modern, I won't say dissection, but maybe subversion of ghost stories. First of all, that line that between like ghost and human that was blurry in the first segment is totally annihilated in this one. Like
Oh
she
yeah.
becomes so human in her interactions with him that she bears three children for him. Or with
Yeah.
him. I mean, depending on how. And I thought
Mhm.
that was just a tremendous detail, especially considering how it ends. Like she has so
Right.
fully committed to her role as human. She's become so human that she's actually had three human question mark children.
See, that's the other thing that really creeped me out is the idea of like not only like did she have children with him, but like I don't know, like the way he cared about her, I guess, and the way she kind of seemed to care about him. And there's that kind of, I guess, almost you know gender role reversal, I guess if you want to call it that. Like she's the one leaving, him with the children.
Leaving him with the kids, yeah.
Yeah, and
Mhm.
it's like so.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Well, and
And
that's
you know,
another great representation of that trope too, where you get that in so much of the mythology, where these supernatural forces will choose to spend time with a mortal, and it never ends well for the mortal. It never goes well. They always wind up leaving, or they leave a wake of destruction behind them.
yeah.
Children are often a factor in those stories too. I mean, you see that all the time, especially in the Greeks. God knows the gods in Greece just fucked anything that walked and left their seed in, whatever the hell they wanted to, and it always seemed to take root somehow. So I mean, it was kind of an interesting.
Right. You're right. I mean, that is very much rooted in mythology, the idea of supernatural beings intermingling and interbreeding with humans.
Mhm.
But within the context of what you expect, I think, from a ghost story, that was really shocking to me. Uh, and I think that it was just this, like, the degree to which, as I said before, she becomes human. But
Yeah.
you were talking about the ending and how usually in these stories, like, you say they leave destruction in their wake. What I really thought was wonderfully subversive about this story and very like modern or maybe even like postmodern or at least very like modern in the way that in its consideration for human psychology is
Mhm.
how this ends and how she responds when he does what she's ordered him not to do and he tells the story. First of all,
Mhm.
just the very fact that he betrays her to her out of love for her, right? The fact that the
Yeah.
transgression is actually simultaneously an act of intimacy, that he's become so close to her, that their relationship is so perfect that he feels like he can share this thing with her, this thing he could tell nobody else. And the fact that the act of doing that is what destroys their relationship is just so like wonderfully ironic and profound and just perfect, like, and so above and beyond what you expect from a story like this,
Mhm.
like it's so like ambiguous and complex in a way that the payoffs to these stories usually aren't. But the fact that I feel like most other movies, I mean, they've set it up already. If you say this, I'm going to kill you. So the you were expecting her to make good on that promise. What you're
Yeah.
fearing for his life in that moment. But what she does to him is so much worse. Like
Oh yeah. Yeah.
and so much more effective than killing him and so much more true that she actually, first of all, it's psychologically true for her that she would not want to kill him and leave the children
Mhm.
with nobody. It's psychologically profound in that, like, it's another place where she's showing real human emotion. She can't do it.
Oh, very much so.
But it's also so fucked. The way she just walks out, because first of all, that's fucking like even just that is in some ways a fate worse than death for him. Because first of all, here is like this perfect, wonderful, intimate relationship he has, and he loses it in a second, and he has to live with that loss for the rest of his life.
Mhm.
And he has to live with the fact that he never like he was with her for a decade, and he never made the connection before, and here he was living with this otherworldly thing, and that's gonna be with him forever, and he's gonna be reliving that moment in 100 different ways for the rest of his life. He's going to be saying, first of all,
Yeah.
on some level, he's going to be saying, why did I say that? Forever, he's going to say, why did I
Mhm.
say that? If I just
Yeah.
hadn't said that, I would have been so happy until the day I died. But on top of
Right.
that, he's going to be thinking, oh shit, like I slept with that. I was with that was sleeping beside me for 10 years. I mean, at least the first guy only had to deal with the fact that he slept with his dead wife for one night. This guy was with a ghost for 10 years
Right.
in every single
Yeah.
conceivable way, not just like sexually, but like romantically. Like they had meals, they just sat around the table and ate together. He made
Yeah.
shoes, he made these sandals for her. But the real fucking kicker, though, is that in the morning he's gonna get up, and he's gonna have to, like, first of all, he's been left alone as a single father, but he's gonna have to make breakfast for 3 kids and have them walk into the room and look at them and realize, I don't know how human my own children are. I
Yeah.
don't know what
Yeah.
my own
Exactly.
children are, and I can't tell my own children, like, they're gonna, where's mommy? What are you gonna say? What the fuck are you gonna say? Like,
Yeah.
anything you say could potentially put them at risk, but also opens up the whole can of worms of you having to try to figure out what your own children are.
Right.
And that,
And
yeah,
and if he treats them any differently or gives them any reason to complain about him as a father, she'll come back and kill his ass.
kill him,
Yeah.
kill him, and
Exactly.
then what happens to the kids?
Right.
And so that's it. So he has to, like, carry this tremendous psychological burden around, and just the whole way that plays out, like, I think makes this kind of quintessential modern in like the modernist sense ghost story.
Yeah.
And I just
Yeah, I
was
mean,
totally like enthralled with that.
it was
Definitely.
such a perfect execution of the phrase "death comes slowly,"
Yeah.
because that, like you said, that is an agonizing, excruciating amount of emotional weight dropped on somebody. That is just absolute emotional brutality,
Right.
and
And,
it was so beautifully executed.
and he never gets to re-enter the human world. He'll never
No.
be able to fully re-enter, because even with her being gone,
No.
there's no coming back. And I don't know. I just thought that was great. Anything else anyone wants to say about this second one?
I
The
want
Woman
to
of
comment
Stone?
on the very, very last visual,
Oh yeah.
Mm.
because to me that was one of those poignant moments. The sandals out and sets them in the snow, and you just watch the snow gradually cover them.
Yeah, just
In
consume
just
that.
a few quick cut shots. That to me was a poetic ending, and I love that about that vignette.
Yeah, it was a wonderfully poetic concluding scene.
Mhm.
Anything else? Okay, let's move on to Hoichi the Earless. And Rudy, this was your favorite, right?
Oh yeah, either this one or the last one, I'd say. So. All
So why don't you start the discussion for this one?
right. Well, I don't really have actually much to say about this one, except I like the I guess one of the themes, or I guess maybe it's a theme. I'm not really sure what this really was trying to say, but I think it might have been something to do with like the way art kind of tends to consume someone and tends to make them, maybe blind to certain things. I guess.
Yeah.
Um, I guess like the way he kind of is really desperate to get his to get to have someone listen to his playing, his recital. This is a guy that's memorized, like this whole epic battle sequence, this whole, play that has to do with, or I guess it's a musical
It's
or
a
something. Yeah,
ballad.
a ballad, yeah.
Yeah.
And he's memorized this. I mean, how often does he get to play that to those monks? I mean, probably not very
They don't
often.
give a shit,
They
right?
don't give a shit about that. So, I mean, this is
Yeah.
this is like his only outlet is like these ghosts, this kind of ephemeral like thing that he no one else can really see. And
Yeah.
then there's the idea when he comes back from it, they scold him and they're like, you've been in a graveyard the whole time. Like, what the fuck were you doing out there, just playing to the stones or whatever?
Right.
I mean, it seems kind of like a take on maybe like kind of struggle of an artist or like someone who struggles with creative work maybe.
Right. How desperate any artist is for an audience, especially an appreciative audience, right?
Yeah,
Someone who can get the and I mean what better audience could you imagine? Like he is
yeah.
playing
It's literally captive audience. I mean, it's like
not only literally captive, but he is playing this historical ballad to the actual people who lived this event,
who lived it.
and they
Yeah,
think it's the best telling of it they've ever heard. Can you imagine
yeah,
that as an
yeah,
artist to have like there's no better audience, and to have them eat up everything up like that, no wonder
yeah.
it's so addictive, right? No wonder he would be totally consumed by that, even though he
Right.
didn't know. On some level maybe he did.
Yeah.
Um
But yeah, it seems it's just like the perfect thing, like you said, like people were saying earlier, like halfway between fantasy and reality, I guess. And it's like, did he imagine this, or did he, it seems as you're going through it, you're wondering, is this like something he's imagined, or is it something that he's like wishful thinking, basically, or is
yeah,
it real, so.
right.
I really like the fact that they kind of do devote particular attention towards letting you know that like it is real because like the monks fully acknowledge it and they kind of like immediately believe him. Like
Yeah.
there's no
Hmm.
tedious debate of like, oh no, it was definitely real, and they're like, oh no, you're just imagining things, that wasn't present. And I appreciated
Yeah.
that they just kind of went immediately to, oh yeah, that's what happens, like if you go with the ghost, he's gonna fuck you up,
Yeah.
like you listen to him once, that was dumb. All right, now what are we gonna do to take care of this? I appreciated that, and it made it feel very. It was
Mhm.
a very strange feeling, and also the other two monks following him and both seeing and also not seeing the same thing that he was being sort of integrated into.
Oh, that scene
Hmm.
is incredible when
Yeah.
they
Yeah.
find him in the graveyard and he is still like at least within his perception, he's still in the company of this like phantom audience, and then
Hmm.
that fades away, and what they see and what he sees and what like the way the scenes basically almost dissolve into each other, like the ghosts are left standing there in the graveyard at one point, and they and at another point they're just these like spectral arms floating around, and
Yeah.
it's just
Right, but it
really
definitely changes from what it was before they like those two characters appeared at like the same steps that sort of
right.
transfer into the ghostly world. So like some real aspect, but you're not exactly sure who can see what or what's appearing to who.
Right.
But it
Mhm.
really blends that supernatural into like the reality of the world in a way that feels like that's really amazing, but also it feels like how the Japanese view spirits of
Mm.
as it's just sort of like a thing that, happens, like,
Yeah.
you got to do what you have to do to deal with them, but then leave them alone for the most part. But if you fuck up, just deal with it.
Right. And the idea
Mm.
that this is a world that's almost overlaid on our own.
Right.
Right, absolutely.
Yeah, one thing I definitely like is the part where, like AJ said, they don't fuck around with like, wondering whether this is real or not. In fact, the priest actually says, like a ghost visited here the other night. That is a fact. He says.
That is a fact.
I thought that, I thought that was pretty cool. Where they just like that. That's a good, way to kind of transition into and then at the end, he becomes rich and famous. So that, again, the kind of wish fulfillment thing. I mean, that I thought was pretty cool
Yeah.
because it's like, hey, it's this guy that went out there, he played for the ghosts, and then they ripped his ears off, and then
And then the
but he
boon
still
comes.
yeah,
The reward for all of it.
yeah, exactly. So it's a it's a, I guess, a happy ending.
It is. And that's one of the things I also loved about all the stories in this collection is that horror movies tend to make you like they work because of the fear of death, right? The
Mhm.
idea is that you put a protagonist in harm's way or multiple protagonists and then you threaten them with death or you kill them and people get scared. The amazing thing about this movie is that um even though it's a ghost story, none
Mhm.
of the protagonists die, and none of the central characters, in fact, unless you consider
Right.
the wife from the first segment, die. The penalty that these people face for like entering this other world is never death. It's always like profound transformation, which I think is very true to folklore and a lot
Yeah.
more interesting than threatening someone with like being killed by a ghost.
Mhm.
Uh, and in the first one, this guy is totally in the black hair. The samurai is totally psychologically and physically ravaged by this experience, but he leaves it alive. In the
Mhm.
second one, we talked about the psychological weight that he's going to have to bear for the rest of his life. And here in the
Mhm.
third one, Hoichi, I mean, he gets fucked up, but
Yeah.
he ends up getting a remark like he's able to take his art. Like his art is transformed by it in a positive way that makes him legendary, and
Right.
that's interesting. It's actually you could potentially see the first two films in the first short films, the first two segments in this anthology as being films about relationships, like about romantic relationships or human relationships, and then the second two about being about art. I think about whether it's storytelling or about art and like the creative process, right? And in the first two movies, like you get two different views of like of love gone wrong in some ways, or love twisted by the supernatural, or love like you have one story about a man who makes what he later realizes is a really stupid, selfish choice, and comes back and tries to make amends with his wife, and does, but then pays the consequences anyway for his actions. And
Mhm.
then in the second movie, you have this kind of perfect idyllic relationship that's destroyed by this one like moment of both in ironically both intimacy and indiscretion, right?
Mhm.
uh, and then in the second one you have the first one is in the second half the first one is the story about this basically tortured artist, right? Who, through his encounter with the supernatural, pays a tremendous physical price, but becomes rich and famous. And then the second story is about someone who seems very secure in his art, but has to deal with the fact that his story is left unfinished, and like that, just the whole like question of what does that mean, to have a piece of art that's never completed. But it is. I think that's another way in which the structure of this movie works. It's almost like two pairs of films.
Mm. Yeah.
But,
Yeah, that's a good way to frame it. For me, watching the vignettes in the order that they were in made me think of meal.
think of
Yeah,
what?
your appetizer.
Oh, meal. Yeah, sorry.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, appetizer. The black hair. That's your appetizer. That's what gets the taste buds going. It gets you excited to eat the rest of the meal. The woman in winter, or the woman of winter, and that's kind of like your salad course. That freshens up the palate. It gives you something very familiar and something that you're very used to.
It's nutritious too.
Yeah, it's nutritious. It's got some soul to it. It's got that nutrients that you need to Hoichi the Earless, and that's the entree. That is the meat of the movie.
Yeah.
It's kind of ironic for me to say that, because for me, Hoichi was the one that I had the hardest time staying focused on.
Yeah.
But it was in a weird way, because I really did enjoy it, but at the same time, left me at a point where it was almost lengthy for me. I wish it would have been either shorter, longer, and been its own standalone film.
Yeah,
Balancing point.
I think calling it the entree is very appropriate, because this is definitely like the beefiest segment. This is and the richest one maybe too at the same time. Is it too long? I don't think so. Although I will say that there's an alternate cut of this film that cuts about 20 minutes out of the total film, the total running time of the film, and I think the most cuts are probably in that version, which was the version I saw first, are probably in the Hoichi segment. They cut out the scene where they find the body on the beach. They cut out that long, very Japanese funeral sequence. They also, interestingly, in that one, the black hair ends very soon after he discovers his dead wife. Like the moment where he stumbles away and looks at his reflection in the well, it actually ends there, which I think kind of does a disservice to that one.
Yeah, definitely.
They cut the nude scene out of The Woman of the Snow, which I think was done because this was a cut for Western audiences at a time when bare breasts were not really that acceptable in Western film. And the scene where they visit her mother's grave, her mother-in-law's grave, rather, which I think was another thing that was cut just because it was too Japanese. And there are no cuts, I believe, to In a Cup of Tea, which how could they cut anything? It's so lean as it is. But it is interesting that they do probably cut 5 or 6 minutes, I think, out of this one in that version. But I do actually enjoy the length of this one, because it feels, even though it's much shorter than a standard film, it feels epic when played against, or played in the company of the other parts of this collection. And I think that's very intentional, because the subject matter is epic, like in the most traditional sense of the term. You
Mhm.
know, and it in fact deals with someone reciting an epic ballad, you know.
Right.
And so for it to feel that much larger, I think
Mhm.
is very intentional
Mhm.
and effective.
Yeah, yeah. I also wasn't really a huge fan of the repetitive aspect of
In that this is goes back
personal
and he goes
taste.
back and he goes back.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but that's
Mhm.
more of a personal taste because I'm not only am I not really a fan of dealing with subtitles because of the distraction from the visuals,
Mhm.
I'm really not a fan of musicals, even when it's as appropriate as it is in Hoichi the Earless, because it is. It's very appropriate that he is continuously performing
Mhm.
ballad. It's fitting,
Yeah.
but for me, it's just like musicals.
Oh boy, I don't know, Rudy. What did you think of that?
I like the song element of it. I thought it was definitely appropriate. Um, the way they intersperse the battle and the song is pretty cool too. I mean, just visually.
Yeah, and the way that his like phantom audience evolves over the course of his
Yeah.
performance of the ballad. Like they start off, it's a very sort of traditional, almost court setting, and they're dressed in a very like formal way, and they're very kind of cold and detached in appearance. And by the point that you almost get to where he's going to be interrupted by
Mhm.
the people who are searching the graveyard for him. Like they've totally transformed into their battle garb, and the
Oh,
background has gone from being this kind
Yeah,
of washed out color to being this bright, vibrant red color, and
right.
like it's and like they've got their battle makeup on and these like tortured expressions, and by the end like the stage there is lined with their corpses, and it's like
Yeah.
they're reliving the battle while he performs his
Yeah.
ballad, his musical
yeah,
performance of the battle, and that was just I really loved that.
Mhm.
yeah. I thought that was a really nice touch too, because you see it a lot in cultures as well. When you see this of attention to the spirits, and you really focus on them, what drove them in life, and you apply that concept of, and you see it a lot, especially when it comes to dealing with deities and mythology.
Mhm.
Strong is the amount of worship that you give them, and seeing that transformation of these spirits from being kind of weak and drained to suddenly having all of this life and vitality through this song and through the artistic representation of it. I think that's just
Mhm.
such a great visual representation of that whole concept.
Right.
Yeah.
And also their need to like experience this retelling of their lives is another way in which this film really humanizes the ghosts. But I want to get AJ. AJ's been on the outside looking in for a while here, and I want to get her involved in this.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I can definitely see how it could be repetitive, as there are two different times when he performs the same song, but there are subtle differences between those two performances, it feels, and that's particularly outlined by the visuals during those times. And there's a particular scene that I'd like to highlight during the second performance, where it sort of focuses on Hoichi on his platform, and um, like the surrounding area around that platform. Like you're not sure, like it's mist, but you're not sure if it's just
Oh yeah.
floor underneath, and then
Oh, right.
certain parts of the mist part and you see water, and it
Right.
strikes you like
Oh man, that was
so
so
hard.
effective.
It just like gets like right to your core of that water and the mist. Something about that is just so surreal and yeah, very effective. Like
Yeah.
really striking. Like I'd go back and watch the entire movie just to kind of experience those few seconds again.
Yeah, that's what Tumblr gifs are for. But honestly, though, I agree with you. And I mean, we've been saying time and time again how visually captivating and striking this film is, so I don't think we need to relive that too much. But this is, along with the Woman of the Snow, one of the most visually striking and
Mhm.
just incredible segments. Also, the way that they interspersed these very traditional Japanese paintings into the retelling of the ballad, along with their kind of with the more dramatic reenactments or and performances, I thought was pretty interesting as well and pretty effective.
I'd also like to say that the makeup in this one was also amazing, particularly with some of the warriors. Um,
Yeah,
in some of the scenes, you're seeing the 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 traditional Japanese paintings depicting, the battle going on, and then it cuts back to the live actors, and the samurai's face like twists, and there's a lot of makeup, but it seems natural, and it seems almost as if it's like a live representation of like a mask that a traditional Japanese
Mhm.
mask that you'd
yeah,
see, which is absolutely kind of stunning.
yeah, absolutely, it is. So, before we, I think we're probably pretty. You guys agree we're probably pretty much ready to move on to the last one, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
Yeah,
please.
yeah.
There is one thing I want to mention though, which, and I'm not even sure how I feel about this, but I just want to throw this out there. This is the only segment of the four that features comic relief in the form of these two
Yeah.
like scared shitless monks or assistant monks or servants or
Yeah.
whatever the heck they are, who are kind of tasked with like looking after Hoichi and like
Mhm.
keeping him out of trouble, and then like bringing him like retrieving him from the ghosts. And there's these like a series of almost like slapstick scenes involving them and how scared they are. And I don't really, I mean, it was funny, but how did you guys feel about that? Did that take you out of the movie? Did you enjoy it? Did you you know?
I liked it. I enjoyed it. I have a feeling that they might have been there because it was so long to sort of keep the audience drawn in, but I don't think
Mm.
that it took away anything. It didn't like break the atmosphere. It didn't take me out of the movie. I thought they were funny, and um, it was better to be laughing at them rather than laughing at like an unintentionally funny part, like the hair jumping at man's neck in the black hair. So yeah, I enjoyed that aspect.
See, I would disagree on that. I think for me, it did kind of take me out of it, and I think that might be a facet to why I kind of drifted a little bit during Hoichi the Earless, because in the entire 3 hours and 3 minutes of the movie,
Mhm.
those two guys are the only ones that I have so little recollection of. For me, they were completely forgettable, and the rest of the film was so easy to get into that I think it's kind of strange that mentally I almost blocked those guys out now that
Rudy?
I'm thinking back, because
Sorry.
that was just one of those trailing because
Oh, okay. Rudy?
moments.
Well, I mean, you ever as a kid when you were listening to a really scary story, like crack a joke to, I mean, and when you're doing it, you're still scared. I mean, when you're cracking the jokes,
Yeah.
but you're doing it, I guess, to for that nervous laughter, just to feel that nervous laughter in you,
Right.
and that to me was what those two guys basically were, is they were the
Yeah.
audience, cracking that nervous laugh, and I thought it did a good job of that. And also, let me say that on a more racist note,
I was waiting for this.
the
Oh,
now I know that physiognomy or whatever it's called isn't really like a respected thing anymore because it's incredibly racist. But the way they cast these guys, I mean, it must have been on their minds. We have to cast some lower born looking type of dudes to fill that role, the role of those two guys, because those guys looked exactly like the stereotype of essentially like I don't I'm trying to figure out a delicate way to say it, but
They look like
basically
cartoon characters.
they look like cartoon characters. Exactly, they look like a very cartoonish stereotype of like a lower class Japanese person,
Let me
basically.
say this: they look like a cartoon character that Theodore Geisel, aka Dr.
Yeah, Dr.
Seuss,
Seuss.
might have
Yeah,
drawn during the height of the Second World War.
right. Exactly. That's exactly
Yeah,
what they look.
yeah.
And the other ones, the monks and stuff, you can tell they don't look like that. I mean, and it's just, I mean, there's a real stark difference between them and like the two monks, the two head monks, the older guy and the younger guy, the fat guy.
Yeah.
They have a real distinct appearance. And Hoichi has this kind of distinct, like almost noble appearance. But those two guys, they
They also have
definitely
a distinct appearance.
they have a distinct appearance, but it's it's what I don't know what.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, no, I know. I know
Well, and
exactly.
that's a time honored tradition in Western cinema too. I mean,
oh yeah,
outside of his own movies where he is the writer, producer, and director as well as the star, you don't see Larry the Cable Guy being cast as a lead actor.
right.
No, you don't.
That's not wrong.
You don't see that. You don't see the fat, uneducated rednecks being put in the lead role. No, they're the comic relief. It's
Yeah,
Yeah, no, that's a good
I'm sure it was the
point.
same thing at work. It's
That is a good
looking
point.
for a caricature. It was just,
yeah,
These are hillbilly
slobbing
stereotypes.
that we've got. Yeah.
That's what they are. They're hillbilly stereotypes, but coming from a
Yeah,
different
exactly.
culture. They're Japanese hillbilly stereotypes.
right.
I mean, every
Yeah.
culture has it.
Yeah, that's true.
I will say, since you mentioned that Hoichi has a very distinctive look, in a movie that's full of really great casting, I think he may be the best cast character,
I'd
not
agree
only
with that.
in this segment, but in the entire film.
Yeah,
Like, just there is something just really unearthly about him, and something just incredibly just incredible about his performance. I don't want to belabor the point, but I think it's a really great performance.
Yeah.
So AJ has informed me that she is falling asleep.
Oh,
I'm asleep
typical.
right now. I'm
Oh,
asleep
God.
right now. I'm
God
sorry.
damn it, AJ.
That's what happens when the sugar wears off.
AJ, who ate 2 whole fun-sized packets of M&Ms prior to taping, which you wouldn't think would be that much, but apparently,
It worked for a while.
okay.
Oh, you were a rabid wombat before we started this.
I was. Yeah.
sugar crash.
So let's move on then. Let's do In a Cup of Tea, which I don't think we need to talk about for too long, and then let's wrap up, because probably prior to me editing out the parts where we were having technical difficulties, this probably is going to be close to the length of the film. So, anyone want to say anything about In a Cup of Tea? AJ, why don't you start talking about this one uh, while you're still awake?
Um, I really liked. I really liked this one. Now that I think about it, it might actually be my favorite. Um, I liked that it was shorter, and I liked that it got pretty meta.
Gets extremely meta.
And I loved the scene where the character of his story was fighting the 3 lackeys or whatever that came for him, but you can't see them. All you can see are the shadows. During like that scene in the fight, that visually got me pretty hard. I really like that. And also, like, the action during that entire scene, even with the encounter with the ghost originally, um, it all seems very unpredictable in a way that you would suspect would mirror what supernatural events really are like if they actually were to happen in reality.
Mhm.
Um, the effect of the guy in the tea was a little bit hokey. I mean, like they were doing the best that they could, but it kind of um I'd say that that sort of took me out of it a little bit. But other than that, I really enjoyed it.
I actually really liked the guy in the tea effect, just because it was right on that line where it was so mundane in a way, in that it was very clearly a reflection,
Yeah.
Mm.
but it was a reflection with no source, which is what I think. One of my favorite things about this section is it's really great example of finding horror in the mundane, which is fits as like an endpoint for this series, because you have this journey into where the first one starts mundane and by the end you're in the realm of the supernatural, and the second and third ones are deep in the realm of the supernatural, and then this one is almost an easing out of the realm of the supernatural up to the point where you actually see the storyteller. Oh, until the end when boom, you're hit by it again. But so I like the idea of, like, how many times have you been creeped out by something subtle, something that was just not right, something that wasn't like transparently spooky? That's one of the things I like about this. There's no like spooky up until the very last scene, like ghost makeup stuff going on as there is in some of the earlier ones. Like the guy's reflection in the
Mhm.
glass of tea isn't that scary. He's actually almost making kind of a funny face. He seems almost
Yeah.
amused up until the moment where the dude drinks him. But there's something so unsettling about that, about having something happen and not knowing why it's happening or how it's happening, and having it happen in the middle of the day in broad daylight during like the most mundane part of your life, during the most mundane act you could imagine, which is just drinking a cup of tea, just going into. And also that whole segment though where he like takes one glass and he looks at it and he's like, "Ugh."
And he
you know
throws it away.
and
Yeah.
he's like, what the fuck?
Mhm.
And he throws it, he gets
Yeah.
another one and he's like, oh shit. And he fucking chucks that one on the ground and breaks it. And then
Yeah.
he draws the third one out, and you can see he's like, you know what, no, fuck you, buddy. He drinks
Yeah.
it. And it's something like just that, so like, I don't know, wonderfully true to life in that, in the way. It's one thing to be presented with something unexplainable at night, where your natural impulse is to draw away and hide. But when something like that happens during the day, you're just like, what?
Right.
And your response is like
That's a good point.
contempt,
Right.
because you can't be. It in the broad light of day, something like this isn't immediately scary. It's just really weird. And you're just really angry that your life has been turned upside down by something you don't understand. And so
Right.
his response is very natural. And then the escalating sequence of increasingly bizarre consequences to it are also, on the one hand, almost slapstick, but on the other hand, like really disturbing. Like, Rudy, in fact, it made me think of one of your favorite uh ghost stories. The wait until, what is it?
Wait till Martin comes. Yeah.
Wait until Martin comes, and the way it's
Right.
structured.
Yeah. Yep.
Right? Did you want to talk about that a little bit?
Uh, I mean, yeah, it is. It is like that one, I guess. I mean, that's the one with where the guy goes into the house and sees the cat, and then there's another cat there, and it starts they start talking, and he's like, "Well, what should we do to this guy?" And then they're like, "Well, we won't do anything. We'll wait till Martin comes or whatever." And then it gets. How does it go? There's like another.
Bigger and bigger cats
They
come
keep
in, right?
getting
The
bigger,
third
and yeah,
cat comes in, and he's bigger
and
than the
you're
second one.
wondering.
Right.
Yeah, basically, you're wondering when you're going to see Martin, and then the guy finally gets up and says, "Well, fuck this, I'm out of here." Martin can shove it or whatever.
Right, exactly. And
But
this functions in a similar way because you have that teaser there. In fact,
Yeah.
in the penultimate scene where the guy's like handlers or like servants show up.
Yeah.
And they're
Yeah.
like, he's coming next week
Yeah,
on
he's
this
coming next
day,
week.
and he's gonna fuck you up. And
Yeah.
you're like, oh shit, what's gonna happen? Like, you start to
Yeah.
think, what's going to happen? Because this guy has been set up in such a weird way. First, he like manifests himself in the cup of tea, and then he shows
Mm.
up in the guy's house, and he like. You know,
Yeah.
he does this supernatural shit and he walks through a wall and he disappears. So you're
Yeah.
waiting for the punchline when he shows up and
Yeah.
really fucking wrecks shit. And then of
Right.
course the story ends before you get that.
Right. Right.
Yeah. And that is just an interesting kind of conceit in ghost stories. Like the idea of a ghost story where you don't get an answer. You don't why was any of this happening? Who knows? You know?
Right.
And I think this is really effective in that way. Anything else you guys want to say about it?
Well, I mean, going back to the analogy of the meal, you had your appetizer, you had your soup and salad, you had your entree. To me, this was the dessert.
Mm.
That
Or it's the
moment
cup
of
of coffee.
satisfaction, or the cup of coffee. Yeah, it was that moment of satisfaction. You had that faster pace to it. It was one thing after another, just boom, 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 just that gratifying, that satisfying gratification moment. And I think this is what really just brought the whole movie together for me. This was that punctuation mark that you want at the end of the sentence. This was the dessert that you want at the end of the meal. This was just awesome.
Yeah. I agree.
Yeah, I agree.
And it also I think I mentioned this, but this one is once again shot in a lot. Even though it's dealing with really weird subject matter, it's shot in a much more direct, conservative, kind of mundane way than the two middle ones. Like you don't see the hand painted backdrops aren't here anymore. The a lot of there's not the same like over the top makeup work that you see in some of the others, except for there's one moment, there's a couple small moments there. It feels like you're being drawn back into the real world, and then it does transition totally to the real world, where you actually see the author writing the story, right? And you think, and that's when you like take a breath, and you're like, "Oh God, I'm safe! Like I made it out, I escaped,"
Oh yeah, that's
you
true.
know.
That's true.
And then there's until you get to the very end, and
Mhm.
the writer himself is claimed by the ghost story, and you find out the reason why the story was left unfinished is because the story in some way presumably consumes its
Mhm.
teller.
Mhm.
And that I thought was interesting. Like that is the real kicker that this needed. The idea that to send you like have you turn off
Yeah.
the movie just deeply unsettled. Because it would have been so cathartic to have the writer finish the story and be like, well, we'll never know, but you're back in the real world, you're safe. It was all just a bunch of ghost stories. But to have that
Yeah.
moment where the ghost story claims its teller, where that world like reaches out and like grabs him,
Yeah.
that really like nobody's safe, right?
It's almost like Inception when you see the top spinning or whatever at the end. It's like, is this the real world or is there another layer? Is there, whatever?
Yeah. Are you ever outside of the ghost story? To what degree
Yeah.
might
Yeah.
there be
Yeah.
unseen forces at work in our own world? Like and
Right.
to what degree, like, does the telling of ghost stories create phantoms of a sort?
Right. Right.
Because he's actually almost in another world at the end. It's only because he's trapped within the well,
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's another instance where you have, like in the black hair. In fact, it's almost a perfect parallel to the black hair, where you get to see the characters respond to the horrifying thing before you
Mhm.
see the horrifying thing, and still the horrifying thing isn't diminished by the fact that you've seen people respond to it.
Yeah, that's true.
In fact, that may be like the scariest single visual in the film is him in the well and like just like the pallor of his skin and the fact that he
Mm.
looks neither dead nor alive and like
Yeah.
he's groping like is he trying to get out, is he trying to like what is like
Yeah.
and then just the image of the empty cup on its side, it's just, we're done.
Yeah.
AJ, are you still awake?
Yes, but I think your last two words "were done" should be in, like, we should bring that meta into the podcast.
Uh,
I don't
We're-
know. I think we
well,
should
in
keep.
the spirit of the film, I do have one more thing I would like to add.
Mhm.
Oh God.
Sorry, AJ. Sorry, not sorry. This is what you get for interrupting me like 4 times tonight.
God damn it.
But one thing that I would like to add, and it's not actually about the film itself, but something about Filmstruck, which is where you guys can view it, because I don't know if we mentioned that at the start, is that Kwaidan is actually in a film collection that's curated by Toro.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
And I think
Yeah,
that's such a
yeah.
telling little factoid, because Del Toro has really made his mark in making these still films that kind of bridge the gap between world and this sweeping paranormal
Hmm.
presence.
Right.
And
That's
so I
true.
thought that was just one interesting little factoid, that he's the one that brought this uncut version of Kwaidan to the Filmstruck.
Hmm.
And that's just such a telling what kind of movie and what kind of an impact this film has, that a filmmaker who I greatly respect and admire and enjoy his works bring this film back from its edited down form.
Yeah.
Hmm.
I think you could easily see this as a precursor for something like Pan's Labyrinth, which is a movie I'm really
definitely.
ambivalent about in some ways, but I definitely think you could see how his visual style was informed by this movie.
Absolutely.
Cool. Are we done?
We done.
We're done? Fuck
Done.
it.
Fuck
Fuck,
it.
Fuck it.